Welcome to the Brute Strength Podcast, bringing you worldwide experts from all areas of health and fitness. We cover training, nutrition, coaching, and mindset. Welcome your host, strength and conditioning coach, 2012 and 2013 CrossFit Games champ, Michael Cazue. Mind, body, brute.
Hey, before we get this show started, let me quickly tell you about a program that we just launched called Outside the Box. When we first started Brute, we simply served people that wanted to train for and compete at the CrossFit regionals and games. Pretty quickly, we transitioned to also working with people that wanted to compete in the open, people that just wanted to look better naked, people that wanted to compete in weightlifting, as well as a host of other goals. About a year and a half, we started hearing more and more from members and former members that their priorities were shifting, that their goals were shifting. They wanted to focus more on their relationships, on their careers, on new hobbies. And they didn't have the same desire. They didn't have the time or the means to train for an hour or two or three or four like they did when they first signed up with us. So we created this program with them in mind. Outside the Box is a 30-minute-a-day program for 5 days a week, and it requires minimal equipment. There are 3 different tiers. The first tier requires only a set of dumbbells, and each higher level requires more and more equipment. So whatever you have, we've got something for you. At Brute, we really pride ourselves in bringing together experts in every area of the sport of fitness. And so when we were thinking about creating this program, we realized that we didn't have anyone that was an expert in general physical preparedness. So we had to go out and find that person. That's when we decided to team up with the founders of Warm Up and Workout, Pat and Taz Barber. Pat has been a CrossFit level 1 and level 2 instructor, as well as a flow master for years. And I've seen the level of programming that he and his wife have created for their company, Warm Up and Workout. And I can say without reservation that these guys get it better than anyone on the planet. So we found our experts, we created our program, and it's ready to roll. If you're the type of person that really takes his or her fitness seriously, but you also want to have the time to focus on your careers, your relationships, your personal health, and you don't want to spend hours and hours in the gym anymore, then this program is for you. If you want variety in your programming, if you want to know that you're going to continue getting fitter without having to put in the same amount of time that you're used to as a high-level competitor, then this program is for you. If you're interested, you can find out more at outsidethebox.fit. Hey, and welcome back. My name is Mike Cazue, and you're listening to the Brute Strength Podcast. This week, I am joined again by Eric Helms. Eric is the co-founder of the 3D Muscle Journey, as well as the author of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids. Eric is one of my favorite guests of all time because he not only has a very high level of technical ability in nutrition coaching, nutrition science, as well as exercise science, but he has this unique ability to explain and communicate very high level principles in all 3 of those domains to lay people and to do so in ways that really make sense to people like myself. In this episode, we go into a lot of different directions. We talk about mental health, we talk about preventing burnout as a high achiever. We talk about eating to 80% fullness and something the Japanese call hara hachibu, one of the main tenets of their nutrition philosophy that leads to them living very long, healthy lives. We talk about caffeine and caffeine withdrawals, plant-based diets, as well as supplementation for weight loss and fat loss. Every time I get on an interview with this guy, I learn so much, and so I know that you're just going to love this show. If you have not done so already and you've been a regular listener of this show, I'd really appreciate if you would take some time to leave me a quick review on iTunes. And if you love this show, please hit the subscribe button and share it with a friend. Enjoy. Eric, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back, man. Always an honor to be here.
Yeah, I was telling you before the show, I feel like I know you as well as any of my best friends because for the past, it seems like 6 months, we've done at least one recording per month, whether that be a live cast on the Brute or WAG side or a podcast or some form of interview. And one thing that I love about you most is really not your depth of knowledge in the technicalities of nutrition, but it's in that you are someone that's extremely self-aware and you have this unique ability to explain very high level principles and concepts in a way that makes sense to a layperson like myself. So I always enjoy our conversations, man. Welcome back.
Well, I enjoy your compliments, so I'm happy to be here. Thanks, bro.
No, I enjoy you more.
Oh, well, let's just enjoy each other.
So a few days ago, I saw a post on your Instagram that absolutely floored me, man. It was the 10-year anniversary of your dad's suicide. And it was the first time that you had ever spoken about it publicly. Can you tell us a little bit about this time period and what inspired you to kind of come forth with it now?
Yeah, it's something that I wasn't comfortable sharing for obviously a decade. And before I did share it, well, there's a lot to unpack here, but I've done a lot of emotional work, a lot of personal work around it. And before I decided to go public, I talked to, my aunts, my uncles, my mom, and his widow, my stepmother, all before doing that, because he's not just my dad. He's
Right.
He's a brother. He's a husband. He's an ex-husband. He's a co-parent to me, and it wasn't just my thing to speak about. But I also have, as I've come to terms, well, as much as one can with what happened, I realized just like how important destigmatizing and talking about suicide is, and depression and what leads to it. And it's something that still occurs at alarmingly high rates, even in our modern society where we spend all this time talking about mental health. And I think no small part of that is that it is still a little stigmatized. It is something that you don't want to bring up. It is something that is looked at in some corners of our society as a negative for various reasons. And obviously, when anyone dies, it's a negative. But I think it has a social stigma attached to it that I think prevents people from talking about it, and then makes it more difficult for people to get help when they're going down that path.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel best when I am doing something proactive about things. So this is obviously close to my heart, and I wanted to use what the small platform I've created and not abuse it. That's why I reached out to my family to make sure it was appropriate and they were comfortable with it, to try to do something positive. And it seemed like I've got a number of things in this 10-year anniversary going on right now that are kind of helping me relive that experience, which might sound like, whoa, why would you want to do that? But I think, for one, it is cathartic. It allows me to remember what happened to me, how it affected me, what happened to him, what I imagine he went through to get to that point. Mm-hmm. Reminds me that that's a huge part of who I am now, and in, I guess, a more deep sense, it's a way of me honoring his memory, and what he was to me, and making sure that I'm not blocked, if you will, emotionally. Because one thing I learned through that whole process was that wasn't something I could process in any kind of way that I knew how previously, like the death of someone a little less close to me, or something that was probably the most major trauma I'd experienced, and I didn't have the coping
Certainly.
skills to deal with it. So anyway, things came out sideways. So now, by revisiting it in some degree, I can kind of see, are all my channels flowing, if you will, emotionally? Like, are there things I'm bottling up or compartmentalizing in a way that's not healthy that I'm not aware of? Which is unfortunately something I found that I can do pretty effectively. So yeah, I've kind of talked around it from a lot of different angles, but back in February 2009, I was 2 months into a contest prep for competing in bodybuilding. And when I got the news, and my bodybuilding season very much became a pathway because it was very difficult to feel much, if anything, about it. I felt myself shut down pretty quickly, and it would only come out sideways and in chunks, and I would have to facilitate it through therapy or group therapy.
What do you mean by sideways? How would it come out?
So I'd get mad, or I would be, I would do risk-taking behavior. Nothing crazy, but like I'd be like, why am I speeding all the time? Or why am I, like, I would make comments that were just off the cuff, fast and loose, judgmental. It just seemed like something was taking up my RAM, if you will, like if for tech speak, like,
yep.
It was like I was running too many operations at the same time, and some of my decision-making skills were not worse, but different. Like I think at some level, some part of me just, pardon my French, just didn't give a fuck, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I think, because it took me off guard, it messed with my trust of thinking, how well do I know people, or how well do I know anything? So whatever, you know. And that wasn't something I was really conscious of for a while. It was just, it would come up, like my wife Barb would be like, "What are you doing?" You know, and I would go, I actually don't know what I'm doing. But to speak to how well that experience was compartmentalized, the day after, I competed in a powerlifting meet and hung out with everybody, and we went to go grab food, and nobody knew except for a close friend of mine, Alberto, who was one of the first people I reached out to. But and then that was the next day. The night prior, I actually went to a game night with some of my friends, did the whole thing totally normal, and I wasn't thinking about it, and I didn't tell them about it. And the fact that I could and did do that freaked me out more than anything else, because I was reflecting. I was like, that's not normal. So it made me realize, just, okay. And it became very obvious over the weeks and months and years that accessing my emotions about this was not going to be any small task in any kind of straightforward way. That's kind of the why I use that verbiage, sideways, because it makes sense to me. It would be like they would sneak out. Something would be bothering me that I would think objectively, this shouldn't be bothering me. And I would realize it was just taking the face of what I was actually feeling.
Got it.
I also noticed I could become a lot more empathetic to other people. So if someone came up to me and said, "Hey, I lost my father, brother, sister, friend, etc., to suicide, and it was really hard," and if they started to show some grief or pain, all of a sudden I would start crying or feeling it, because I could do it through them, but it was very difficult to do it in a straightforward way on my own. So yeah, that was the time. So now I'm going through my first contest prep in 8 years. I've started this campaign to try to generate awareness and also, just more concretely, raise funds for suicide prevention. So yeah, that's what's going on.
So now it sounds like I know a little bit about what wasn't working, which is compartmentalizing and trying to withdraw from your emotions. But obviously, whatever you've done has worked incredibly well. You seem like a very, like an exceptionally empathetic person now, as well as a self-aware individual. So what what was the recovery process? What was the recovery process you took that actually started to work for you?
Well, the funny thing is you said what wasn't working was trying to withdraw. But the funny thing is I was trying to engage. I just couldn't.
Interesting.
So I'm a very fortunate man. And I mean that in that I have a supportive wife. I have an incredibly supportive family. And I have a lot of people to go to. So I think that's one thing my dad really didn't. Is he just didn't have those kinds of bonds with people to be able to feel like he could talk about anything or maybe even explore it internally himself. Like some of those qualities that I have, like that you mentioned, that I'm very grateful to have, and I think it's part of my upbringing, of self-awareness and having a strong emotional bonds and a support network with people. Ironically, even though that was fostered in me by my dad and my mother as well, my dad didn't have those things, not to the degree that was necessary at that time. So I think it strengthened my resolve in that those things are important in life. That having people you can discuss the true depths of everything going on with you is really important. Understanding. There's nothing wrong with seeking out therapeutic help. My mother's a marriage and family therapist. My uncle's a psychologist. So on my mom's side of the family, that there's a big part of that is kind of part of our value system, part of our beliefs, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So my dad was never against any of that. It's just it wasn't part of his life. It didn't come from his side of it. So I had, fortunately, just all the influence on that side of the family and all of that ability to reach out. And of course, my dad's family was very empathetic as well and was always open to them. I could call them at 2 a.m. if I wanted to. But anyway, what worked was therapy. So I did intensive group therapy, and then I did one-on-one therapy. And then I stayed up with kind of those skills I learned and changes I made through staying a part of support groups. So I've had a men's group, quote unquote. Not that it's like exclusive to men. It's just I formed a men's group where I was part of a men's group that was already formed of a lot of gentlemen who had experienced trauma and of one type or another, and could connect on that and feel safe in that space to talk about it. And then I kind of replicated that sense here in New Zealand. I up until last year, actually, I saw a therapist as well. And I think, it's been one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life to do that and to pursue that. And I think it's fostered both of those qualities, which is, it's really cool to hear you say that you see those. I mean, self-awareness and empathy for others. And I think, it's helped me unstick things. Like the bodybuilding prep, like I said, became this kind of vehicle and catalyst for dealing with it. It allowed me to feel physical pain, physical fatigue. It allowed me to push and strive and try to succeed and to fail in some cases. I don't mean that, not placing first is a failure, but that competitive outlet and that giving up control to judges and pushing very hard to do that and feeling fatigue, restricting myself. All of that became kind of this physical way and a mental and emotional way of feeling things when I couldn't quite do it in a more direct way there. And I think that preceded me going to therapy. And I think that was probably needed to some degree. But yeah, so that is what did work for me, and really leveraging my support network and actively seeking help. Because like you said, what was happening wasn't necessarily working.
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense, man. Why I think we get along so much. I don't know how much I've told you about my story, but I battled addiction as a teenager and have a very similar recovery story. So makes a lot of sense, man. Thanks for sharing that.
For sure.
So,
And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. And I know we'll have the link to the donor drive and everything. But yeah, I really do want to see if we can make a dent here. And I appreciate the platform to do that. So
hell yeah, man. So you're playing the game of life at a very high level. You're actually someone I would call a peak performer, someone that's performing at the highest level at a certain industry. And one thing that I know can be common for high achieving individuals and peak performers is that they become so obsessed with achieving and striving for something that they forget about their personal health, their mental health, etc., which is probably all the more risky for you coming from where you come from. So how do you take care of yourself today? What are some strategies that you have in place or systems that you have in place to prevent burnout, prevent depression, all of those sorts of things?
So cool thing about the emotional adaptations we make as we grow up and become adults that can be problematic is they almost always can be extremely helpful too. Every adaptation worked for us in some scenario but didn't work for us in another. They're double-edged swords, right? So for example, my ability to compartmentalize, and I'm not going to unpack where that probably came from and go back to when I was like 3, but I think my ability to compartmentalize, which prevented me from having an easy path or maybe a healthy path towards dealing with my father's passing, is probably my greatest asset when it comes to handling all those questions you just had, managing the potential stresses and preventing burnout, preventing obsession, and maintaining some semblance of balance and happiness. So I'm really good at compartmentalizing things. When I put on my coach's hat and I log into my emails and I record Skype videos, I do Skypes, record videos, and send my clients voice messages and write programs, that's all I'm doing. And I think I talk to a lot of trainers who they feel like they've always got the weight of their clients on their shoulders. Like, they're texting back and forth, they're sending messages, even when they're not, they're thinking about it. I'm really good at when I'm there with my clients, I'm there, and when I'm not, I'm not. And I think that's important. And when I open an email from a client, it's like it opens a pocket of neurons in my head, and like, oh, now I'm doing this.
Right.
And then I can flip that switch, and I can be with Barb, or I can be in the gym. And so when I'm training. When I'm with clients, I'm with clients. Interestingly enough, I think social media has created a unique challenge to that, because when I first started coaching people, we were barely using Facebook, and Instagram didn't exist. Notifications weren't really a thing on your phone. So like I've had to teach myself to hit airplane mode when I go in the gym now, or I can all of a sudden short circuit that compartmentalization skill I have. Right. And then then I can't multitask because I do one thing at a time. And oh my God, I've got this pop-up about a client. I'm in the middle of the bench press, and the one goes to hell. So anyway, actually leveraging that compartmentalization is really helpful for me. So if I go to AUT, where I have my PhD students and I run meetings and I do research fellowy things, that's all I'm doing. And when I'm doing coaching, I'm doing coaching. When I'm training, I'm training. And when I'm on a podcast with you, my lovely friend, that's all I'm doing. And then once that's over, I move on to the next thing, and I keep my day just simply partitioned like that. So each day I wake up and I handle my daily Instagram post, where I'm trying to put out something at peak hours that has a meaningful value, or at least useful content for my audience. I'm answering emails, and then I do some writing or some work or a podcast. And then after that, I am training. And then when I come home from training, there's a 1 to 2 hour window where I can do work if need be, if I'm behind or didn't complete everything earlier in the day, or that can be just recreation time. And then I cook dinner with my wife, and then we watch Netflix until we go to bed. And that's pretty much it. So I think that's the way I do it, is that I keep it all compartmentalized.
I'm not sure if it's just the guests that I get on the show, or if this is just a trend in society in general or the fitness industry in general. But almost every conversation I'm having right now has like two topics come up. One is what you've been talking about, which is it's kind of like mindfulness, right? Being wherever you are, being present with whatever activity you are currently in, and just the sheer power in what you're able to do and feel when you're in that state, when you're not thinking about the past or the future, and you're just thinking about only what you're doing in that moment. And the other is this piece about technology and how we have to be vigilant with ourselves when using social media or email, or just allowing ourselves to be constantly bombarded by notifications. It's funny how that keeps coming up.
Yeah, and well, because there's very real effects of it. If you look at there's some stuff on neuroplasticity and like what adaptations and what skills do you develop by being on social media, and it makes a lot of sense. You get really good at splitting your attention,
Right.
short form communication, getting faster, but you don't have that same level of depth. You're not reading anything that's longer than whatever the 150 characters on Twitter, or the couple paragraphs on Instagram. Facebook's a little different. I think it would probably prove to be if you're in like an in-depth discussion group, but that's a very different skill set than say reading a paper in a journal about the mechanisms of hypertrophy or fat loss or something like that. And I can tell immediately that if I've been on social media for 3 hours and then I go and I try to read an in-depth journal article, man, my eyes are popping up every couple sentences and I'm thinking about something else. So I have to reread the paragraph. So I think you have to pay attention to what are the skills you need to do your various jobs,
Mm-hmm.
and then how do you safeguard against some of those tools, having a double edged as well. Not smashing your thumb with that hammer.
Right.
So for me, that's been interesting because social media can be a cool way to stay connected with your friends and family. But when you start using it as a business and then you are successful with it and you're having a certain number of followers and people you follow, and the number of messages, tags, posts, message requests you get on like 3 different platforms becomes potentially overwhelming. That's when you have to treat social media very differently.
Right.
So like, you get the feed disabler on your Facebook all of a sudden. Now you're no longer staying up with your mom, on Facebook. Or maybe you have 2 different Facebook accounts. One is your personal, one's your business. Or all of a sudden you start using that mute function on Instagram with pretty much everybody except a handful of people, so that you can engage but not be sucked into it in a negative way. And that's a very, very different way of engaging with social media than it is when you are someone who's just on there to have a distraction and you're trying to be distracted versus trying to prevent distraction while using the platform. So
Right.
that's an interesting paradigm. And I think it's difficult when you're in that early stage of growing, where you are still just a private individual who doesn't have a huge level of success on social media, but's working towards it. And you have those holdover behaviors from when you use social media differently. The upside of that, and this is a bit of a tangent from your question, is now that my social media I use much more as a tool, as someone who's trying to fulfill my mission statement, is that I make more meaningful connections in person. I'm not trying to maintain a bunch of relationships online because,
Right.
like I said, my feed's disabled. I've used the mute function a lot on Instagram. I use Instagram, I use Facebook, and I use YouTube as ways to reach an audience. And then if I want to connect with people, I'm doing that by email, Skype, or in person. So it's different.
I've brought this book up half a dozen times, but I'll keep doing it. And you, I think, would love it. Are you familiar with Cal Newport, Deep Work?
I am, yes.
Okay.
I have not read it though.
So he just came out with Digital Minimalism as well, which is a similar book, but speaks specifically to how we use technology. And one of my favorite things, and you'll read this in Deep Work if you read that, he talks about the way that we view apps on our phone, we look, or really any technology, we look at it. We have what he calls the any benefit effect. If we see any benefit at all from using a piece of technology, then we just assume that it's a good thing. And so we put the app on our phone, or we buy the new TV or the car or whatever it is, but we rarely ever take into account the downside, the negative effects that these things are having. So you're talking about things like you're repatterning your brain to be better at short form versus long form content. We're getting better at attention splitting, but not being present. Our attention is constantly being fractioned and pulled at by companies that are spending billions of dollars in order to do that, right? Their whole goal is to get as much of our attention as possible. And so it makes sense why these things are so addictive.
Absolutely. And the effects are real. Like, I just wrote 3 blog posts for the 3D Muscle Journey and, our website. And normally that takes 3 months, and each one's a little stressful. And they all occurred since I started becoming much more controlled with my social media. And I don't think that's an accident. So I think that's a very, very real phenomenon. And you're right. That is the whole goal of the companies behind social media. And it's very easy to go from, oh, it's all positive to, oh, it's all negative too. And I don't think it's negative. Like, if you're if you're the marketing head of a business that is online, you're going to need to do some attention splitting. You're going to need to rapidly respond to messages, tags, and posts on 3 different platforms simultaneously. You need to engage with your customer base. You need to look at analytics and quickly make decisions. You need to get your Gary V on, as you might say.
Right.
And that's okay. That's good. But if you're a one man or one woman show or a few women and men show where you've got to put on multiple hats, that's where you got to start thinking tactically and about how one can affect the other. And I think that's the situation where I'm in, is that I'm a science communicator, which means I have to do science, which is deep work, and then I have to communicate it, which means social media, and I have to balance that push and pull, or one can take away from the other quite easily.
I like that. I have to do science. I think you need a t-shirt that says I do science.
I would not mind it if someone sent me that shirt.
We'll see if we can make that happen. So for the rest of the show, I'm basically just going to bounce around and ask you a bunch of things that I'm curious about personally. And I find that when I'm asking out of that space, it usually makes for an interesting conversation. So I told you before the show that I'm doing a month of no mind-altering substances. I'm really on this roll of removing as many things from my life as possible in order to see what's underneath, right? I'm just pulling back layers of the onion to see what my psychological tendencies are, my behaviors that are getting in my way. And it started with no sugar for a year about 5 months ago. And then we started doing this keto experiment. So there's a ton of different foods, almost all carbohydrates off the table. And then I felt really inspired to do an experiment with no substances. So no caffeine. I was taking nicotine mints. I would smoke marijuana occasionally. I would drink, once or twice a month. And I just wanted to see what would happen if I just went completely without. And so really what I want to talk about is caffeine, especially because I think this one is something that relates to almost everyone in our society today. The first week was completely miserable for me. I've withdrawn from cocaine before. As a teenager, and it felt very similar to withdrawing from severe or intense cocaine use, where I was just incredibly irritable and drained all day. Just life in general seemed like it kind of sucked, and it seemed like I was just going to be that way personally. So my question to you is, what effects, positive or negative, do you think caffeine and other stimulants have on people?
It's a good question. And I'll preface my answer with saying that I am, as always, I am a bodybuilding and powerlifting researcher. So my knowledge of stimulants comes only secondhand through that. So I'm definitely not a neuroscientist, and I'm definitely not a stimulant expert. That said, I have read a fair amount of research on caffeine as it affects muscular performance, as it may affect fat loss, and some of the things related to withdrawal, how it affects you, etc. And a little bit on some of the individual differences with caffeine. So the short answer is that the way caffeine will affect you, and it might affect someone else, is quite different. Mm-hmm. If people are, kind of onto the whole genetics thing these days, they will know that there are fast and slow metabolizers of caffeine, and largely positive health benefits are shown in people who are fast metabolizers. It doesn't stay in your system too long. You get the stimulatory effects pretty quickly. The half-life isn't as long, so it doesn't interfere with sleep as much, which is one potential mechanism. And if you look at a population level, there are associations between caffeine intake and health, primarily. That's what the majority of those studies show. Now, it's actually quite difficult for us to look and determine causation from that. So that's a correlation, right? If we look at, hey, let's stratify people who reported different caffeine intakes, track them for years, and look at their health. We can't know that one is causing the other. Maybe that people drink caffeine, do other things. So one proposed mechanism, and this is also potentially in effect why red wine sometimes shows positive health benefits, is that people rarely drink caffeine or wine alone. You're often, it means the more red wine you drink to some kind of reasonable threshold, and in coffee and tea, etc., means that you're having more lunches with friends or dinners with friends. You're connecting with people. You're getting a little less inhibited, and maybe you're having deeper discussions and making better friendships. And we have a lot of data to show that human connection is really important for happiness and quality of life. So it might be indirect. It also depends on how you're getting your caffeine and how you're getting your stimulant delivered. For example, nicotine delivered via cigarettes is very clearly a negative for health. Right. But delivered through other means, it's really not that clear. And at the very least, it seems a little more innocuous, right? As far as negative health effects. Not to say that there are none, and not to say that we have all the research. But we definitely know cigarettes are a negative, and some other delivery forms different, right? Same thing is true of caffeine. For example, a lot of the positive health benefits that come from coffee might actually be related to the other phytonutrients that come from the beans that it's made from. And I don't think taking caffeine pills would provide, I don't think it would be a harmful effect for most people, again, depending on your individual genetics. But I don't think it would be as positive as drinking actual coffee or tea, etc. So that's two angles on this. That's looking at individual genetic differences. That's looking at population level statistics and different delivery forms of the same drug. And it is a drug. I think that's something that people should be made aware of. The withdrawal you're experiencing also, that can be quite different between individuals, depending on how much you're taking, how much of and your individual genetics, how long you've been taking how much, and then how quickly you come off, whether you taper it or whether you come off immediately. And I think any decision is all about having an informed choice and knowing what the pros and cons are. So, for example, for someone interested in performance, you want to know what can caffeine potentially give you, and then what are its potential costs. And then there should be probably some self-experimentation. So caffeine in a certain range can improve performance. Past that, it can actually degrade it. Below that, it might just make you feel a little less tired. And if taken at the wrong time of day, or if you are a slow metabolizer, it could potentially harm performance in the long run, or at least harm adaptation because it's negatively affecting your sleep.
Right.
So those are all things to consider. And also I do think and I'm not an addiction studies specialist, but I can tell you that people who have currently struggle with, or identify themselves as addicts typically don't do well with even small amounts of substances that can be addictive. It often gets out of hand. And as we've seen through the success of like 12-step programs, sometimes drawing a hard line in the sand and saying, this is just something I'm not going to do, ends up being better on net balance. Because the ability to moderate gets slowly eroded, or there's a risk that you won't be able to. So I think that's something to consider as well.
Yeah, that's what's happened to me 3 or 4 times in the last couple of years, where I will remove it completely and then I'll start having it very moderately, but it always just creeps back up, man. So I'm at the point where I'm going to give it one more shot at 1 cup a day. And then if it happens again, I'm just going to it's just not going to work for me, because now that I've fully gone through the withdrawal symptoms, I feel incredible and my energy levels are way more stable later in the day. It's just so valuable to me to be able to have like multiple more hours in the day where I feel like myself. I don't feel like a shell of myself.
I like that. And because you mentioned you went through a sugar removal and a keto phase, and now you're removing mind altering substances. I think, in the flexible dieting community, there's probably a lot of people who are hearing that and going, man, I don't want him to be overly restrictive. And, there's a downside from removing things. But I do think if done intentionally, there's a lot of value in this kind of practice, and I'll explain why. So if you go to a registered dietitian and you're saying, hey, I'm having irritable bowel syndrome, I am having stomach pain, I'm having an allergic reaction, but I don't know what it is. What they do is they do a systematic removal of nutrients, starting with the ones that are at the highest likelihood of causing this response. And then once they get you to the point where you are no longer having this allergic reaction, they start reintroducing these foods to figure out which one it was. And it's very difficult to isolate the cause of a problem unless you can remove all the other confounding variables. And that's something that really resonates with me as a scientist. And it's something I do in my coaching practice with myself, etc. So by effectively, quote unquote, cleaning that slate to some degree, I think it can allow you to get a better sense of what has been working for you. What have you just been doing that might not be necessary? And what have you been doing that might have cons that outweigh the pros, or just are a negative? And that is really a kind of a systematic approach to behavior change. So I think if someone is listening to this and is a little wary or really wants to try it, I think be intentional, especially considering food is not optional. Right. I would recommend that if you are going to do this with your nutrition, is you still want to keep in as many foods as you can, especially of the fruit and vegetable and healthy variety for the most part. But yeah, I do think there's value in going through this process. You probably learned a ton about how you feel with certain things in, certain things out, and it might inform your choices down the line to make you a better, more high performing human, as you said earlier. So.
Yeah, I can't encourage you guys enough to just continue eating. It's going to benefit you in just about every way. Just keep eating food.
Well said.
Yeah, for me, the reason that I'm like completely removing these things is because I know for me, like I have these addictive and compulsive tendencies. It just doesn't work for me personally to slowly remove and moderate things, because I am in this mindset of relying on things too much. So if I'm going to make decisions from an intentional standpoint, I need to clear my mind and like break some of those addictive tendencies. And then I can intentionally add things back in. I wouldn't recommend this to everyone, but I know there's always a portion of the population that is better abstaining from things, at least for a certain period of time. And I'm certainly one of them.
No, that's well said. And there's definitely moderators and abstainers out there. And I think learning how to work with that is pretty important when it comes to behavior change. So well said. Yeah.
Another thing that I've been trying to work on, and I got this from an interview I did with John Berardi. He said that they teach two things when they start every client. And John is the CEO and founder of, or not CEO, he's one of the co-founders of Precision Nutrition. And one thing that they do with every new client is they teach them to eat slower, to be more mindful when they eat, and then to also eat to 80% fullness, rather than until they are stuffed. And both of those are so outside of my comfort zone that I knew there were things that I needed to focus on. And this eat to 80% fullness, I really started to dive into. And I realized that this is something they teach in Japanese culture. And they call it hara hachi bu. This eating until you feel some pressure on in your stomach, because it takes a little bit longer for our brain to register that we're actually full, for those neurotransmitters to do what they're supposed to do. It takes a little bit longer for those to kick in than it does for us to actually be full. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why a strategy like that might be effective for people.
Oh man, I think paying attention to your hunger and satiety cues is so important. I think that's something that it's got a bit of resurgence now, but it's been largely absent. And it's been largely absent from the conversation in a number of different sectors. So, for example, in the sports performance sector or the bodybuilding sectors, you'll hear stuff like, "I eat to fuel the machine." Bodybuilders will actively tell you, it doesn't matter how hungry I am. I follow the diet. I'm trying to get shredded. Or it doesn't matter how full I am. I'm trying to get huge. And that's normally followed by comma bro. And then in some of the weight loss sectors, there's a huge focus on foods that are more satiating, foods that are higher in fiber, foods that are higher in protein, and these allowing you to eat less calories because you're more full. But what they don't talk about is giving some granularity to, or tools to the person about assessing what is my fullness. And this is actually something I'm going to really quickly plug a forthcoming free course we have at 3dmusclejourney.com and the 3DMJ Vault. Our registered dietitian, Steve Taylor, he's created a course that is free. You can check it out. It's not launched yet, but if you give us a few more weeks, it will be, where he talks about a lot of the behaviors around why we eat. And he did a YouTube video where he was saying, hey, just rate your fullness and hunger on like a 1 to 5 scale. And that's something I do in my coaching now, and that we're doing a lot more with 3DMJ, is simply getting a number. Because when you sit down and you think about it, like, not am I full or am I hungry, but how full am I? How hungry am I? How do I feel after this meal? And then how can I modify that? Mm-hmm. Because like you said, eating slower. Oh my God, look at that. I got fuller after that meal because the meal took longer and it had time to actually create some hormonal response and some actual mechanical signaling in my stomach. And your food choices, the time of when you eat, what you eat, how quickly you eat, whether you're paying attention or distracted while you eat, all these things are going to have a measurable impact on your hunger and satiety after you're done eating. And to be able to manipulate that, that's really important. Yeah, of course it's about energy balance. Of course we want to do things to make you fuller, but how do you know? How do you get the biofeedback on that to actually know if it's working? That whole adage of what isn't measured isn't managed. We get that when it comes to these kind of quantitative things, but we're pretty shitty at that when it comes to feelings. So I think it's really important to have a rating of fullness, or at least some awareness of your hunger and satiety, especially if you're using external cues to help you decide what to eat. Like if you're an athlete and you have a certain target for calories or protein or carbohydrates or ranges or what have you, or an eating schedule, that's great. That might help you meet your goals. That might provide you the structure you need. But Then you need to know, is that plan working for me? Like, am I constantly hungry or constantly full? Am I uncomfortable because of that? Or do I need to modify the food I eat before training because I'm literally stuffed, but I still need to get fuel in? So maybe I'm going to keep the calories, but change the source so it's lower in fiber or it's liquid or what have you. Like I'm good for my weight loss or weight gains at the right pace, but man, after dinner, I'm always starving. What can I do? Like, I think these are things we want granularity around, and we want to be able to identify versus just using willpower to try to get past them, because that is always a finite pathway, and it will eventually run out. And if you want the goal to be sustainable, or you want the plan to be something you can sustain, then you need to consider those aspects for sure.
So if someone's working with a coach, obviously they can have an ongoing conversation about these little behaviors and psychological tendencies. What advice do you have for people that aren't working with a coach to start to develop this sort of self-awareness?
Great question. So for example, if you have a coach, maybe they don't have you rating hunger or satiety, but each week you guys report in or you touch base and you just share subjectively what the last week was like. And that hopefully comes up. And then you look at interventions, he asks you questions, and you both get a very good sense. And through that conversation, you generate self-awareness. Fantastic. That's a good coach who's doing their job. If you're on your own and you're like, right, so I went to this meal plan macro generator or whatever, and I've got this plan, you need to start kind of acting as the coach for yourself. That's kind of the trick, right? So you lack objectivity when it comes to yourself. You can't see your own blind spots because guess what? They're blind spots. So how do you get around that? Well, you have to treat yourself like, okay, if I was coaching me, what would I do? And getting that kind of one step back observer position or perspective is really important. So I think tracking things like hunger on a 1 to 5 scale on a daily basis, and satiety on a 1 to 5 scale on a daily basis, and then looking at, okay, what was happening here? Why were my hunger and satiety levels here? And what was I doing? What were my intakes? I think the trap that a lot of people who are coaching themselves fall into is they don't feel the need to record things or write things down or quantify things, even subjective things, because they're like, well, I was there. I don't need to do that.
Right.
But then they get stuck with making false attributions. And what I mean by that is that you become a victim to availability, the availability bias. So the heuristic of the thing I'm thinking about as it changes, therefore it must be the causation factor of what's happening. And I can give you many examples.
Give us a concrete example of that.
For sure. So in the powerlifting community, you've got this baseline way of training. Let's say we'll go back 10, 15 years and it's West Side. So we've got heavy maximal effort day once per week for each lift, and then a explosive speed work day on each of our lifts where we're doing 40 to 50%, maybe bands and chains, etc. And then we're rotating in accessory movements all the time. So we go from reverse band, what have you, to reverse hypers, to something. And the thing you're focused on is I'm constantly changing these accessory movements. And when I make progress, it's that accessory movement, but maybe it was something else. How do you know it wasn't that you were cycling up your deadlift from 90 to 95 to 100%? How do you know it had anything to do with your accessory movement and it wasn't just the main program? You don't. Or a bodybuilder, right? Who just has this 12-week diet, and every week they cut out 100 calories, right? They start at 3,000 calories and they cut it all the way down to 1,800, and that's what they do every season. They get on stage, and they notice right around 4 weeks that their glutes aren't coming in, so they start doing fasted cardio. And they go, yeah, I got it. It's 4 weeks out. I got to do fasted cardio to make my glutes come in. Well, how do you know that? You also dropped 400 calories during that period. How do you know it wasn't just that? Maybe it was just time and you were just a little neurotic and you were thinking about fasted cardio. That's what you focused on and you did it. So we can only split our attention so much. We can only hold certain things and associations in our mind. Our pattern recognition is pretty damn impressive, or we wouldn't be sitting here talking today as humans, but it's not perfect. And you can only recognize patterns if you see the variables in those patterns. So I think it's important to not just think you can remember how hungry you were on a Thursday after dinner, but actually write it down. Actually create So some metrics, some things that you pay attention to, hours of sleep, hunger rating on a 1 to 5 scale, and some more quantitative things like calories, protein, and then body composition assessment or pictures. That's another one that I think athletes don't do enough, or bodybuilders especially, is they'll look in the mirror and just kind of assess their physique. The thing about looking in the mirror is that depending on your temperament, you'll look at either your strongest body parts or the one piece that hasn't come in yet, and you will ignore other things. So a really common thing I see in bodybuilders is they will think they look best when they're really flat, when they are depleted, they've been on low carbs for a while, because they noticed a little more detail in this one spot that they've been focusing on. Like, God damn it, my obliques are not coming in. And then finally they notice, hey, I got some obliques, and it happened on my low carb day. That's when I look my best. Yeah, but your whole physique looks shitty. You don't care about your delts anymore. They came in 6 weeks ago. They're no longer on your mind. They're not available, quote unquote, as far as pattern recognition. So this can lead you towards coming into your competition, having told yourself the story that after 2 low carb days, I look my best, coming in flat. And yeah, he looked hard, he looked cut, but he just didn't pop. Why was that? Well, because you were completely focused on having one cut somewhere that's not even visible from the judges table at the cost of your whole physique. So I think that's the kind of thing that when those things occur, that's when you go, right, I need to figure out a way to take a step back from myself. So I'm going to take pictures in the same lighting on the same day in the same poses every week. And then I'm going to open those pictures, even though I can just go look in the mirror right now. I'm going to look at these pictures and think, okay, objectively, I'm my own coach. How did these look compared to last week? And I think if you train yourself and you have a system, and if you take that kind of objective progress, you can do a lot better coaching yourself than you might think with experience.
What was the bias you said?
Availability bias.
Availability bias. Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Plant-based diets. If they are becoming more popular, why do you think that is so? And let's start from maybe a societal standpoint, and then let's go into some of the science behind it. Why might they be becoming more popular right now?
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe define a plant-based diet actually before we move on.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of covers a gambit, doesn't it? There's your full-blown vegan diet where no animal products are consumed. And there's even arguments over what that counts as. Like, if you eat honey, are you still a vegan? And you'll see arguments online about that. But just for not spending a year on terminology, there's vegans where there's no plant-based anything. There are lacto.
You mean animal-based anything?
Yeah, thank you. No animal. Yeah, all plant-based, no animal-based. Swear to God, I know what I'm talking about. There are various levels of vegetarianism. So there is lacto-ovo, which means that you eat milk products and eggs. There's lacto or only ovo. And then there are things that are described as either flexitarian, reducitarian, or only one type of meat. For example, I don't like this term, a pollo vegetarian. That's not a vegetarian. You're eating chicken. Just say I don't eat meat besides chicken if you want to say that. Pescatarian, that works. That means the only meat you eat is fish or seafood, and there may be some limitations there. And yeah, that's kind of the full gambit. I think the reason it's becoming more popular is because there's an increasing social awareness of health being a problem and of the environment needing ways to people want to know what they can do to improve the environment. And also the awareness of economic disparities. Like, there's a reason why westernized countries eat meat and why first world nations eat meat, because it's more expensive. It's just less efficient, right? If I want to eat a cow, I have to feed the cow food to keep it alive. And from a very, very, like, if you're talking bare bones level of resources, why would I feed something to then eat it instead of just eating what I'm feeding it, right? So, for example, you might see...
That's one way to look at it.
Absolutely, right? So, and that's why it's very common among... So, for example, some religions have built-in days of being vegetarian, and that had more to do with resource conservation, if you look at it historically. And if you look at some Middle Eastern countries and Eastern countries and African countries, you will see an increased proportion of plants in their diets because they can't afford or don't have the resources to consume large amounts of meat. So that's very much a Western luxury. So there are potentially economic benefits to reducing meat. It is on a global scale a little cheaper. It's not necessarily cheaper to be like your kind of Whole Foods, organic, super hippie eating, and I can say that because I was raised by hippies. Style of vegetarian. That's perfectly fine, but it's obviously not cheaper, at least for you personally, even if it might have a positive impact on economics. And the carbon footprint of producing different meats is not the same. So, for example, fish and chicken typically have a smaller carbon footprint than red meats, like pork and cows. So some people make decisions based on economic or environmental reasons, or perceived health reasons, which we can talk about in a second. We have very clear data to show that higher intakes of fruits and vegetables are associated with better quality and quantity of life. And I mean, literally until recently, when the carnivore diet became, I'm not even going to say popular because it's not that popular. There's some loud minorities talking about it, and it's kind of this silly thing that we all go like, wow, that's actually a thing now. But it is definitely out there in the internet. But all of the reputable experts, the one thing they will all agree on, whether they fall on the high carb spectrum or the low carb spectrum, or the you can eat meat or you don't have to eat meat, all of them agree, regardless of what academic field they come from or what kind of bias they have. If it's people based on some kind of level of evidence, they will say that fruits and vegetables are good for you. So there's certainly an awareness that they are healthy. There is some debate as to whether or not meats are unhealthy, which type of meats, how they're produced, and what they contain, whether they're processed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But plants are healthy, like fruits and vegetables, good. So that's one reason from a health conscious perspective. And then finally, there is the moral argument, the ethics of it. People who are not comfortable with factory farming, people who aren't comfortable with, inhumane treatment of animals. And people take that to various levels too. There are people who, on like the full-on ethical vegan argument, is typically we're at a point in human technological development where we, as omnivores, yes, we're omnivores, but literally we don't have to eat meat, and we can tick all our boxes. So why not reduce suffering by not killing animals? Because we can make that choice as humans. And then you have it on the kind of the somewhere on that spectrum, but not a vegan. For example, I only hunt my own meat because I know then it's a fast, clean kill. I can be respectful. Or I only eat, pole caught fish, but I don't eat red meat because I can't control their farming chain delivery. But I know that if I get, fish caught by a fisherman, that's really no different than being eaten by a shark, and fish don't die of old age. So, hey, it's kind of like I'm being a natural predator. You can run into all these different arguments. And I think overall, it's a sign of people being more socially and personally conscious of their nutrition choices, which is a good thing. Like you said, though, what is the science? And are people always making informed choices? No, not necessarily.
So what are your views on it from a physical health standpoint?
So if we look at the biggest studies, we're talking, and before I explain the findings of these studies, let me put it in perspective. So we have a hierarchy of evidence in science. Typically at the peak of that pyramid of what's the most important data are meta-analyses. And I actually present it that way only in the context of sports science and sports nutrition, because we never have randomized controlled trials with thousands of people. We're looking at a bunch of studies with 10, 20, 30, if we're lucky, 100 people. And in that case, I do think meta-analyzing, looking at all those studies together and combining that data is the best form of evidence we have. When we look at public health studies, where we actually can look at RCTs where they have, or at least comparative trials where they have thousands that actually becomes stronger evidence, in my opinion. And not that, and some of these are observational, actually. So they're not RCTs. But when we look at these studies that have sometimes tens of thousands of people in them, and they look at associations between health and longevity and diet type, we do see vegetarians living longer and having reductions in all-cause mortality compared to the general population. That's a really important distinction, though, because the general population and a vegetarian are not the same person. The general population who has not modified their diet at all is not necessarily health conscious. However, a vegetarian is someone who has changed their entire life around and made big decisions about what they can and can't eat. And they typically don't smoke as much, don't drink as much, exercise, and are genuinely making more health conscious decisions, are probably more risk averse. So those people are going to live longer and have a reduction in all-cause mortality. Now, when you start to control for all those variables and you compare vegetarians to quote-unquote comparative general population, other people who statistically you try to control as much as you can so that the only difference remaining is the fact that they're eating meat and they're not, now these differences largely go away in the vast majority of the research. So, and also if you look at short-term trials, especially if we're talking about normal, like non-processed meats, you don't see any negative health effects of eating meat. So I think what we can responsibly say at this point is that vegetables and fruits and all the things that are in a plant-based diet are good for you, but there's no harm coming from eating meat. And indeed, if you are full-blown vegan, you actually have to do a lot to make sure that you aren't deficient in things, because we are omnivores. So ensuring that you get all your B vitamins, ensuring that you get iron, ensuring that you get all of your minerals, and ensuring that you get some form of creatine, which I would actually argue is something you wouldn't want to be deficient in as a vegetarian, because we know now that it has neuroprotective effects and it has a lot of beneficial effects that are outside of performance. I think those are all things that you have to pay attention to. Really easy to do if you're a lacto-vegetarian or if you're a pescatarian. It happens pretty naturally. But if you are a full vegan for ethical reasons or misguided for health reasons, then you need to do some things. You'll probably need to be taking a few different supplements to ensure that you aren't actually getting a health detriment from following that type of diet. So you have to be a little more conscious, aware, and educated.
Love it, man. So we've done this again where I had a whole list of other questions that we didn't get through, but we'll have and all of them were about coaching. So we'll have a follow-up about coaching. But with that said, I have one final just random direction for us to go. Supplements for weight and fat loss. What are your views on supplements?
Man, there's if we're talking about supplements and not drugs, there's very few that do much, if anything. And even the drugs have some pretty bad consequences, like that I would recommend people not experiment with. So generally the supplements out there's a few different classes that people will think of as useful for fat loss. There are quote unquote fat burners, drugs that are supposed to raise your metabolic rate to some degree that allows you to burn more calories so that you can not change your diet essentially, or change your diet less to achieve a calorie deficit. But nothing raises metabolic rate that much. Caffeine, pretty minuscule. And back when ephedra wasn't considered a drug, less minuscule, but still even combined with caffeine, not that much, but still it was something. But now that's kind of more seen as a drug, probably for good reason. Raising metabolic rate, as far as I'm aware, there is nothing out there that actually does it effectively. Mm-hmm. The other ones that are out there, different classes, are ones that I would call fuel partitioning agents. So things that modify glucose disposal or help transport fatty acids. And these largely don't do that well in the research either, like things like carnitine or GDAs. They might improve certain markers in folks who are, say, diabetic or pre-diabetic, and might have some other effects, but directly related to improving fat loss, not showing much of an effect there either. Another class of effect would be appetite suppression. And appetite suppression, now there we might actually have something. There are a few supplements out there and components that may have an effect on suppressing appetite. Caffeine, pretty inconsistent, but things like 5-HTP, and there's a few others. I'm not a huge expert in this area. Have actually been shown to potentially suppress appetite to some kind of meaningful degree, which might be worth looking into. So that's pretty much the only area where it's worthwhile looking at, where it's not actually burning fat. It might make it easier for you to follow a diet and stick to it because you're a little bit less hungry.
Gotcha.
And if someone's like, well, hold on, you only said like one supplement and you said you didn't know what they were, check out examine.com. It's a great unbiased third-party website that reports all of the research on human subjects for supplements. And I would go there and just Google appetite suppressant, not Google, search within examine.com appetite suppressant. And there is some, you'll find some good things there. And from what I've heard and based on that research, there are a couple different companies which have products which do have some of these ingredients. And I'm not endorsing the companies or the products, and I don't have any financial relationships with any of them. I'm just aware of them. De Novo has a appetite suppressant, which is based on evidence-based products, as does Legion Athletics. I think that's Suppress and Phoenix, if I recall correctly. So check those out. Look at examine.com. But that's probably the one area of quote unquote fat loss supplements that I think might be worth looking at, especially if adherence is the issue for you, or hunger pangs that typically create cracks in your diet plan.
Do you see any issue with people relying on those long term, or what's just run with that? Yeah,
it totally depends on the situation. So if you need an appetite suppressant to help you reach a goal, but the goal is something you're not trying to maintain, that's totally fine. Like, for example, you're dieting for a bodybuilding show, and after dinner, you are always hungry. And so you take an appetite suppressant, a supplement that's not going to harm you in any of the way. You've looked at the pros and cons and you're like, that's all good. And that helps you not be hungry. Great. Because after your show and after you're done with your season, you should be gaining, 10, 15, 20 pounds or however much you had to lose to get back to a reasonable off-season body fat. And that will go away. You don't need to maintain shredded condition. You probably shouldn't if your goal is to put on muscle mass. And you're doing that for a good reason. Now, if you're trying to walk around shredded all the time, and the only way you can do that is by taking appetite suppressants, you're just covering up a physiological problem. Like, you shouldn't be hungry all the time. That's an indicator. You're probably in a state of poor energy availability. That's probably going to have negative effects in other areas. That might disrupt your sleep. That might degrade your performance. That might degrade your immune system and leave you open to getting ill more often. If you're a female, that might lead to an irregular menstrual cycle, which could long-term affect bone health. You might not have a very good relationship with food, and you are in the grips of a subclinical eating disorder. So yeah, if it's something that is a adjunct to a healthy fat loss plan, and you're not trying to maintain that current state or diet, and this is a time restricted goal that then you're going to leave and go to maintenance, or even in the case of that bodybuilder, you're going to regain body fat, probably not a problem. But if you were using it in any of those situations, it is definitely a crutch or a Band-Aid for something that is going to be a persistent issue that you're just finding a way to control.
Yeah, and one thing that I've experienced in terms of this is it keeps you from having insights about your behavior, right? If you're constantly covering it up, it keeps you from thinking about why you might be hungry in the first place and developing other strategies. So it just keeps you kind of stuck.
Yeah, that's well said. And the way appetite suppressants work is they're attacking it from the physiological side, right? They're not affecting it from the environmental or psychological side, where you get cravings or you smell something or your friend says, hey, how about pizza? And you weren't hungry. And now you're like, actually, pizza sounds good. That's not the side of it it's affecting primarily. It's normally more on the hormonal regulation side or things like that. So if you are physiologically hungry, that's telling you something about your state of energy flux in your body, right? That's telling you something about your feeding patterns in your day. That's telling you something that maybe this is something you should optimize or improve, or maybe just rejig your meal schedule so that your hunger is a little more manageable throughout the day. That could also have a downstream impact on your performance, your sleep, etc. And you don't have that information because hunger is being suppressed at a physiological level. So I totally agree with you there. I think it's something like it's useful for me now. Like, for example, I'm taking Phoenix and it has an appetite suppressant effect because I can't eat as much as I want, or my body would want, or that would optimize performance even, because part of being a bodybuilding quote unquote athlete is I have to get shredded. It's like if I don't show up shredded to my show, it's like showing up to a baseball game without my mitt. I'm just not going to do as well, so I have to kind of accept that there's going to be some negative sides of that process, and that's just the way it is. But if I was, looking to make a lifestyle change and say go from 130 kilos to 100 kilos, and both of those are very maintainable body fat levels for me, then that would be a different story. I'd want to know, how did I set up my diet, and is this something I can modify to be a maintenance plan, or do I have it set up in a way that's actually not perfect or detrimental to my natural patterns of hunger or energy? And maybe I should think about that, and I might not get that data if I'm covering it up with a suppressant, for sure.
Right. Yeah, I think the danger here for people is everyone wants to think that they are the exception, and they can treat themselves like they can do both, right? They can pretend like they have this bodybuilding competition coming up, so they allow themselves to have a crutch or an aid, right? An appetite suppressant, but they expect to be able to get to the weight they want and then use a different strategy to maintain it, which we know just does not happen for 95% plus people.
Yeah, it's a side effect of this whole concept of biohacking, right? This idea that we can just do a few cool, neat tricks, hack our bodies, throw butter in our coffee, or take some pill, or use some app, or delay my feeding, and do these cool little neat tricks, and all of a sudden we've overcome millions of years of evolution, and what we've actually done is created a temporary solution with side effects, and not thinking about the pros and cons of that. So I think, yeah, it's the kind of the same story of looking for quick fixes to not having, when in reality what you need is more self-awareness and getting in touch with what your real goals are and what health means to you. And is there a disconnect between your short-term desires and what you actually know is healthy, and then trying to bring those two closer together. So I totally agree.
Boom. We're in agreement. That is neat. We've done it, man. I appreciate your time. Next time we'll talk all about nutrition coaching.
Always a pleasure.
So we earlier on in the show, we talked about something that you're trying to raise funds for. It's the what's it called? The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.
Yes.
Guys, we will put a link in the show notes. Eric is trying to raise funds for this organization. Do you have anything else to say about the organization, where the money's going towards, and anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They are an A-rated nonprofit organization, a charity organization, and they donate, I think, something like 87% of what they get actually to their cause versus to administrative costs or paying anyone involved. So it is definitely one of the best ratios of what you put in actually going in to help people. So I have my own little campaign I've called Into the Light, which just signifies that we're trying to get around the social stigma of not talking about this and keeping it in the dark. And I'm trying to raise $5,000. Of course, I want to raise more than that. The reason why I've set it at $5,000 is that I'm going to match up to $5,000 of whatever's been donated. So if we can hit that $5,000 cap, then boom, we basically have raised $10,000 for suicide prevention and awareness. So yeah, I appreciate the platform, and definitely check out the link. And any donations from $1 to up are very much appreciated, and will make a significant difference because of the quality of this organization.
Amazing, man. Yeah, I admire so much your coming forth with your own history and using that to do some good in the world. I really admire it, and thank you.
Thanks, man. I'm doing what I can.
Where can people keep up with you personally on social media?
Social media, you want to check me out at Helms3DMJ on Instagram. That's probably where I'm the most active. Besides that, check out 3dmusclejourney.com. That is the number 3, the letter D, then musclejourney.com. And you can find links to my monthly research review with Greg and Mike. That's Mass. You can find links to the 3DMJ Vault, where the crew does videos and courses for people if they want to learn about how to be a better student of the sports of bodybuilding and powerlifting. We've got our podcast. We've got our blog. Both are free. And then I've also recently started the Iron Culture podcast with Omar Isuf, where we explore the culture, history, and science of everything related to the broader lifting culture. And we're on episode, I think, 4. So definitely check that out too. And we are at the Iron Culture Podcast on Instagram, and you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, as well as iTunes.
Awesome, brother. Thank you so much for your time, man.
Thank you.
This episode is finished, but your training journey continues. Head over to brutestrengthtraining.com/SSW and grab your free pack of 32 accessory workouts that you can incorporate into your training and start improving your strength immediately. That's brutestrengthtraining.com/SSW.